It seems like every year that passes, American power weakens further. The US world order is a suit that no longer fits, Fu Ying, then CCP Foreign Affairs Committee chair, wrote back in 2016. The Western centered world order, dominated by the US, has made great contributions to human progress and economic growth. But those contributions lie in the past. Now, that same order is like an adult in children's clothes. It is failing to adjust. But if this is true, does it really matter to the United States, or the world really, that American primacy is maintained? What's the alternative? Well, China could shrug off this ill-fitted suit, replacing the United States as the global superpower. Or we could be headed to a multipolar world with at least two large powers. I don't think many people would disagree that the present world order is imperfect, but who's to say that either of these possibilities would be any worse or potentially better? I mean, I think it'd be a lot worse. A lot worse. China is an authoritarian security state. Under the United States, we do live in a democracy-centered order, however flawed. A world that promotes the values and ensures the security of an authoritarian regime would be way worse. But it's fine if you don't believe me. Maybe I'm an American nationalist who just doesn't really care about ideology, or maybe I just hate socialism or Asians. Maybe China genuinely wants to create a multipolar world, or it's just the pendulum of global power swinging back to Asia after centuries of colonial hangover. Well, it's a good thing that the United States and China are both real countries that really do exist, so we can just look at the stuff they're already doing and compare. American downfall. Maybe. This is actually far from the first time that we've had this discussion. From about the 1980s until after the Soviet collapse, the possibility of Japan's economy overtaking America's was a huge concern. But as the sole remaining global superpower, America's position of primacy in itself raised the question, why do countries want to achieve primacy in the first place? Samuel Huntington addressed this in his 1993 Why International Primacy Matters, writing that states pursue primacy in order to be able to ensure their security, promote their interests, and shape the international environment in ways that will reflect their interests and values. He used this at the time to investigate what Japanese primacy might look like, but we can use the same criteria now to compare American primacy with the possibility of a Chinese one. What do the American and Chinese governments promote as their national values? What are their security concerns? And how do their visible actions advancing these interests demonstrate the goals they have for the international environment? Because the United States is the current hegemon, we have the advantage of being able to examine decades worth of actions in that position to answer this question. The national values that the United States professes are liberal ones. These are referenced extremely often. The human rights to life and liberty, freedom more generally, democracy. I'm not trying to say that the US is 100% successful at doing all of these things all of the time, but they are the core values that shape America's national identity and, yes, foreign policy. Intrinsic to liberal values is the idea that they are universal. Because these values are core to America's political ideology, an attack on them really anywhere in the world is viewed as a threat to American security. The United States feels secure when these values are upheld globally because it wants both good relations with foreign governments and guaranteed access to that country's markets in a liberal economy. Because democracy and open markets are a part of the liberal system, it's only liberal democracies that will consistently share these objectives with the United States. Because of this, America's goal as the global hegemon is to shape the international environment through creating alliances of liberal democracies. We see this clearly in the way the United States describes itself as the leader of the free world. We see this in the history of America's global strategic objectives. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson proposed the creation of the League of Nations. Later, FDR would propose the creation of the United Nations during the Second World War. We have the GATT, NATO, the OAS, APEC, NAFTA, CETO. America's goals as a global hegemon have consistently been to support and ally with fellow liberal democracies. In the process, it has created a world order that centers its own network of liberal democracies, putting authoritarian states on the fringes. However, these universalist ideals can all be to America's detriment. Dear the United States, not every country wants to be you. It's precisely because the United States is so convinced of its own ideology that it's fallen into this trap. The belief that because American ideology is the best, with time it can convince any country to believe in the benefits of liberal democracies. This is a major strategic mistake. It's clear in American policy towards liberal regimes where this belief has often been taken as fact. After all, if liberal democracies are obviously superior, exposure to them should make every authoritarian state adopt that system. In combination with American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States is distinct among all other nations exactly because of these core liberal principles, it's led to this belief existing just as commonly in ordinary Americans as it does in the American government, that everyone actually wants to be like the United States, and if not, we just have to show them. The US has for decades attempted to bring China into the fold of liberal democracies. It's thought that the CCP would allow China to be gradually liberalized ideologically. In fact, while the authoritarian CCP definitely does not want this, it will take full advantage of the opportunities that this assumption and subsequent invitations into liberal systems presents. It has only been recently, as these invitations have faded, that China has begun to indicate a desire to shrug off the ill-fitted suit of the American world order. But if you were paying attention, this has always been the plan. China wants to be China and accepted as such, not as an honorary member of the West, said Lee Kuan Yew, the first prime minister and founding father of modern Singapore, on the subject. Lee was famously close with both Chinese and Western leaders in his time in office. China will want to share this century with the West, perhaps as equals, but surely not as subordinates. So China's decided now is the time to wrestle for global primacy. What do they want to do with it? The CCP doesn't have decades as a hegemon to look back on in order to understand their interests and values, but we can still look at both their foreign policy and their interaction with the American political system to understand what their imagined world order would look like. Using the same definition as we did for the US, what does the Chinese government promote as their national values? What are their security concerns? And how do their visible actions advancing these interests demonstrate the goals they have for the international environment? So, what does China profess as national values? Just to be clear, I'm talking about the values of the CCP, not values that represent Chinese people. As it's an autocratic regime, it's a clear difference in China than in the US. So, what is the CCP value? The CCP sees itself as a legitimate successor to the Qing dynasty. While the CCP might itself have been founded in 1921, it views its own identity as extending through the history of dynastic China beginning in 5000 BCE. This is important because it gives a lot of insight into the way that the regime frequently looks to ancient history to evaluate its own strategic position, as well as to create national goals. It's because of this long view that the CCP describes its own internal security, again, the security of its regime, as deeply intertwined with economic policy and foreign relations. Although nominally communist, the way the CCP believes its own geopolitical centrality is a prerequisite to domestic tranquility is very traditionally Confucian. In the various Chinese dynasties, inclusion and invasion by unfriendly nations have historically caused internal unrest, frequently leading to their downfall. By contrast, times of good foreign relations with countries that have often had a subordinate relationship towards China have led to domestic peace and stable government. From this perspective, we can look at the 14 countries that border China: North Korea, Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, and Taiwan. With this in mind, it's clear that China has made a lot of effort to deepen relations between itself and these countries. But would you say that these are all countries friendly to the CCP? And that isn't the only issue that China has with its neighbors. Remember, the CCP views itself as the successor state of the Qing dynasty. This includes the territories of the Qing dynasty. The CCP views this as central to its own identity and part of what would define their success as a government. As Xi put it, we cannot lose even 1 inch of the territory left behind by our ancestors. What is others, we do not want it all. And if we look at the map of the maximum extent of Qing China and a map of Chinese territorial disputes, there is another part of what concerns China as a matter of national security. The clear outlier to this is independent Mongolia, but as late as '89, Deng Xiaoping was telling George H.W. how those over 50 in China remember that the shape of China was like a maple leaf. Now, if you look at a map, you see a huge chunk in the north cut away. The maple leaf has been nibbled away. So, who's to say, really, whether a more powerful CCP might still consider independent Mongolia as a threat to national security? Although regional hegemony might have been enough to secure the status of Chinese dynasties, in the modern era, global primacy is a security concern for the CCP. Okay, with all of this in mind, let's look at the actions the CCP has taken to understand the goals they have as an aspiring global hegemon for the international environment. The CCP under Xi frequently emphasizes their goal of Chinese rejuvenation. But with what we now know, this applies both to domestic and foreign policy. So, what does Chinese rejuvenation mean? It's a broad concept and can apply to a variety of things as the party finds convenient. But at the center, it means to take advantage of what the CCP has called the changes unseen in a century, since the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the founding of the party, to rejuvenate the nation under the CCP and achieve what the party regards as its rightful status of global centrality. As discussed, this includes the return of all lost territories. But what would a China-centric world look like? Unlike the United States, it would not look like exporting a specific Beijing model to foreign governments. As Ziebig, a prolific diplomat who worked in the Johnson and Carter governments, put it, a Chinese sphere of influence can be defined as one in which the first question in various capitals is, what is Beijing's view on this? To induce this kind of relationship, the CCP has been hard at work creating its own alliances. The One Belt, One Road project, through economic investment, is designed to create this kind of environment. As the CCP describes it, it will create a community of common destiny, referencing a return to historical prosperity closely connected with the idea of Chinese rejuvenation. China exports its extremely advanced surveillance technology, tools that autocrats across the world are extremely interested in, and in doing so, bolstering dictatorships abroad. To surround itself with friendly countries, China has worked to disrupt liberal alliances. It's joined ASEAN as a dialogue partner, disrupting progress in bad faith in order to advance its own territorial claims. Its active participation in the WHO in order to secure leverage over the organization, the result of this was on clear display during COVID. Its increased UN activism has been towards the same effect. The CCP is working hard to decrease the advantages of American ideological and economic hegemony, weakening liberal alliances and shifting the global balance. Eventually, it hopes to neutralize America's liberal network entirely. China's rejuvenation includes the return of China's central position to a new autocratic world, protecting its own regime by privileging autocratic governments at the center of a new world order where liberal societies exist on the fringes. So, we already kind of talked about the downsides of America's ideology, but the CCP faces significant drawbacks as well. As an autocracy, the CCP has the eternal paranoia of every authoritarian state, how to ensure its perpetual rule. It is extremely aware that it does not have the consent of the Chinese people. This has been the main drive behind its advancements in surveillance technology, for example. Beijing is using an impressive array of military, economic, diplomatic, technological, and ideological tools to protect the power and project the influence of a brutal authoritarian regime. In recent years, the party has used this to pursue absolute control over both public and private spheres of China, because if it can't ensure this, its rule over China is far from guaranteed. It's because of this that the CCP views democracy as a threat both internally and externally. Unlike the United States, which is not threatened ideologically by contact with illiberal regimes, such as Saudi Arabia, authoritarians cannot be liberal abroad and illiberal at home. This belief in the superiority of an autocratic Chinese model coexists with a deep insecurity. The PRC is a brutally illiberal regime in a world led by a liberal hegemon, a circumstance from which the CCP draws a sense of pervasive danger and a strong desire to refashion the world order so that the PRC's particular form of government is not just protected but privileged. That is why a powerful but anxious Chinese regime is now engaged in an aggressive effort to make the world safe for autocracy and to corrupt and destabilize democracies. Document 9, a CCP government document leaked in 2012, outlines 6 challenges and 7 noteworthy problems facing the party. The cultural penetration of Western hostile forces and diverse value orientations are 2 of the 6 threats. Meanwhile, promoting Western constitutional democracy, universal values, civil society, neoliberalism, and Western journalism are 5 of the 7 noteworthy problems. This document came soon after the 2011 Chinese Jasmine Revolution movement, which itself was inspired by the Jasmine Revolution that overthrew Tunisian dictatorship. In an open letter from the organizers, read, "We invite every participant to stroll, watch, or even just pretend to pass by the Jasmine protests. As long as you're present, the authoritarian government will be shaking with fear." The CCP responded by addressing movement leaders, censoring the word jasmine on Chinese social media, and even banning the sale of jasmine flowers in Beijing. The way the CCP seemingly overreacts to perceived slights abroad might seem extreme, but this is because there's now virtually no difference between its rhetoric abroad and towards its own citizens. The CCP is extremely aware that it might not even survive contact with democratic ideals. A second setback in the CCP's goal of global primacy is that it does not desire an equal relationship with potential allies. Although the CCP talks about a community of common destiny, what this really looks like is a community that takes instruction top-down, with China, of course, at the top. Nowhere is this more evident than Southeast Asia. Although Xi has said it is for the people of Asia to run the affairs of Asia, solve the problems of Asia, and uphold the security of Asia, at the end of the day, Asians are expected to defer to Beijing. In 2010, during an ASEAN regional forum discussing security in the South China Sea, then CCP Foreign Affairs Minister Yang Jiechi said, "China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact." At the end of the day, the CCP does not see these countries as equals. Over time, this might dissuade countries allegiant to China for purely economic benefits. The goal of Chinese hegemony is to support an ally with authoritarian states that share its values. However, it remains to be seen if the inherent weaknesses to this value system will be too much for the CCP to overcome. Look, I don't hate China because I hate China. I don't even hate China, really. I just don't like the CCP because I don't like authoritarianism and I don't want authoritarian governments to become the global norm. In the words of Supreme Leader Biden,
"I predict to you, your children and grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral thesis on the issue of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy, because that is what is at stake, not just with China."
This isn't just about China or the United States. The world order impacts important stuff like if we have war or peace, and where. International economic and judiciary policy, what international structures do or do not exist, their powers, which countries can participate in them. Everyone is impacted by this. I'm not trying to argue that the United States is perfect, but the only current alternative to an American hegemony is the Chinese one. It's worth really considering the freedoms normal people have in democracies compared to those in autocracies. In an autocracy-centered world order, how much do you think would change?